My name is Chloe, and if there is one thing I've learned about the world in my 22 years of existence, it's that it was fundamentally designed for people who enjoy being heard. I have spent my entire life trying to find a corner of this planet where the volume is turned down just a little bit, a place where the air isn't vibrating with expectations and the constant, draining demand for social performance. So far, I've had zero luck finding that sanctuary in the outside world. To most, I am just the quiet girl in the back of the room, the one who treats eye contact like a dangerous weapon and who would rather walk 5 miles in the rain than have to call a stranger to ask for directions. You see, I am the kind of person who rehearses my coffee order for 10 minutes before I even reach the counter, and even then, when the barista finally looks up and asks what I want, my voice usually decides to go on a sudden, unannounced vacation. I end up pointing at the menu like a toddler, my face heating up to a shade of red that would make a fire engine look pale. It's not that I don't have things to say. My mind is a constant, swirling storm of thoughts, observations, and complex emotions. It's just that the bridge between my brain and my mouth is permanently under construction, blocked by a massive, immovable wall of social anxiety that I've never been able to climb. But there is one place, and only one place, where I don't feel like a broken radio emitting nothing but static. That place is a tennis court. When I have a graphite racket in my hand and a bright yellow felt ball is flying toward me at 90 miles an hour, the chaotic world finally starts to make a beautiful, mathematical kind of sense. On the court, I don't need to find the right words or worry about the tone of my voice. My feet do the talking, my forehand provides the punctuation to my intent, and my serve is the only exclamation point I've ever been able to deliver with absolute, unwavering confidence. There's a raw, honest geometry to tennis that matches the way I think. But there's a catch, a big, cruel, messy catch that has haunted me since I first picked up a racket. Tennis is a sport played in front of people. It's a stage, a theater of physical combat. And for a girl who wants nothing more than to be a ghost, being center stage in a rectangular arena where every mistake is cataloged by an audience is a special, refined kind of torture. I grew up in a small, dusty town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows your business before you've even had a chance to process it yourself. My dad was a high school gym teacher, a man of few words, but a huge heart, and he practically raised me on the local public courts. He saw something in me early on, a natural timing, a fluidity of movement that most professional players don't develop until they're much older. By the time I was 12, I could outplay most of the grown men in our neighborhood, including the high school varsity coaches. But while other talented kids were dreaming of the bright lights of Wimbledon and flashy, multi-million-dollar endorsement deals, I was dreaming of an empty stadium. I loved the game for its own sake, the physics of spin, the tactical battle of court positioning, and the pure, clean sound of a ball hitting the sweet spot of the strings. But the moment a small crowd gathered to watch me play a practice match, my talent would begin to evaporate like mist in the morning sun. I'd start to feel their eyes on me, the weight of their judgment, the burden of their expectations, and the tiny, amplified whispers from the sidelines. My grip would tighten until my knuckles turned white and my forearms felt like they were made of lead. My legs, usually so quick and agile, would feel like they were filled with wet cement, and my brain would start a frantic, self-destructive internal monologue. Don't trip. Don't double fault. Look at how they're looking at you. You're making a fool of yourself. You don't belong in the light. I've spent my whole life being my own most brutal opponent, losing matches not to the person across the net, but to the girl standing in my own shoes. The problems my shyness caused weren't just limited to the sports arena, though that's where the pain was most acute. I remember my first big regional tournament when I was 15. I was the top-seeded player, the prodigy everyone was talking about in the local papers. I had breezed through the early rounds on the back courts, where no one was watching, hitting lines with a precision that felt like magic. But when I stepped onto the championship court for the finals and saw the bleachers filled with parents, college scouts, and other players, I felt a familiar, sickening wave of nausea. My opponent was a girl named Sarah, a loud, boisterous player whom I had beaten easily in practice sessions a dozen times. But Sarah loved the crowd. She grunted with every hit as if she were in a gladiator pit. She pumped her heavy fist after every point, and she looked at the audience like she was a queen commanding her subjects. I, on the other hand, felt like I was physically shrinking with every passing second. Every time I missed a shot, I could feel the collective, disappointed sigh of the audience like a physical blow to my chest. By the start of the second set, I was so utterly consumed by how embarrassed I was that I actually forgot the mechanics of how to play tennis. My footwork became clumsy, my serve lost its bite, and I ended up losing in straight sets. I spent the entire 3-hour car ride home with my face pressed against the cold glass of the window, wishing the car would just dissolve into the air so I could disappear forever. That was the day I made a silent vow. I would never try to be a professional. I would play for myself in the shadows of broken-down public parks, where it was safe to be good without being seen. Fast forward to my life now, and I'm 22, working as a part-time instructor at a struggling local tennis club called The Baseline. It's a charming but run-down place with cracked nets, fading lines, and a clubhouse that smells of old sneakers and nostalgia. It is my sanctuary. The owner, Mr. Henderson, is a kind, elderly man with a permanent tan and a gentle soul who doesn't mind that I barely speak during our weekly staff meetings. He knows I'm the most technically gifted player he's ever seen in his 50 years of coaching, and he protects me. He lets me practice on court 4, the one hidden behind a row of overgrown, unclipped hedges, whenever I want. I spend hours out there alone, hitting against an old ball machine I've nicknamed Lefty, perfecting my craft in a beautiful, lonely silence that feels like home. I thought I had found the perfect compromise, a way to live my life without ever having to face the terrifying glare of the spotlight again. I thought I had successfully hidden my gift from a world that I believed would only use it as an excuse to stare at me and pick me apart. But life has a way of finding the cracks in your walls, even when you've built a fortress of silence around yourself. Mr. Henderson sat me down yesterday in his cramped, trophy-filled office, his face looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen it. He told me that the club is 6 months away from total bankruptcy and foreclosure. The only way to save our sanctuary is to win the upcoming Atlantic Open, a high-stakes regional tournament with a massive cash prize and enough media coverage to make my skin crawl. He didn't ask me to play. He's too decent a man for that. But as I looked at the peeling paint on the walls and the faded photos of the kids who had found a home here, I realized that my shyness was no longer just my own personal burden. It had become a threat to the only place where I felt I actually belonged. For the first time in my life, I realized that staying invisible was no longer an option. If I wanted to save the baseline, I would have to learn how to stand in the sun. The night after Mr. Henderson delivered the news of the club's impending financial doom, the silence of my small apartment felt heavy, almost suffocating. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on across the neighborhood. My mind was a chaotic carousel of images, the peeling paint on the courts, the smiling faces of the kids I taught every Saturday, and the terrifying, bright blue courts of the Atlantic Open. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to decline, to stay in my hidden corner, and to let someone else be the hero. But there was no one else. I knew the financial ledgers of the baseline as well as Mr. Henderson did. We were a community of misfits and underdogs, and if I didn't step up, we would all be scattered to the wind. I didn't sleep a single minute. I spent the entire night pacing my small living room, my hands habitually gripping an imaginary racket, practicing the shadow movements of a backhand slice. I kept thinking about Maya, a 10-year-old girl in my class who was just as painfully shy as I was. She looked up to me. If I ran away now, what message was I sending to her? That fear is a valid excuse to let your home crumble? The next morning, the air was crisp and smelled of autumn. I walked into Mr. Henderson's office, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I was sure he could hear it from across the room. He was hunched over his desk, his glasses perched on the very tip of his nose, squinting at a stack of red-inked bills. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment, I saw the sheer exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of 40 years of maintaining a dream that was slowly slipping away. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words felt like jagged glass in my throat. I took a deep, shuddering breath, gripped the strap of my tennis bag until my knuckles turned white, and finally managed to force the words out. "I'll do it, Mr. Henderson. I'll enter the open." The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Mr. Henderson slowly took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He didn't offer a joyous shout or a celebratory hug. He knew me too well for that. He knew the immense, psychic cost of the sentence I had just uttered. "Chloe," he said softly, his voice cracking slightly, "you don't have to sacrifice your peace for this old place. You've already given us so much." I shook my head, my eyes fixed firmly on a coffee stain on the carpet. "It's not just for the club. It's for everyone who thinks they have to stay hidden. I'm tired of being afraid of the light." The 3 weeks that followed were the most physically and emotionally grueling days of my life. Mr. Henderson, revitalized by a new sense of hope, became more than just a boss. He became a relentless, uncompromising commander. We transformed Court 4 into a training ground that resembled a military camp. I was on the court by 5 a.m. every day, practicing until my muscles burned and my vision blurred. We worked on the technical aspects of my game, increasing the RPMs on my topspin forehand, sharpening the angle of my kick serve, and perfecting the explosive footwork needed for net transitions. But the physical training was the easy part. The real battle was happening inside my skull. Mr. Henderson knew that my shyness was my Achilles heel, so he devised exposure drills. He invited local teenagers, retirees, and even the mailman to sit in the small bleachers and make noise while I practiced. They would shout, cheer, clap, and sometimes even boo. At first, it was an unmitigated disaster. Every time someone shouted, my timing would shatter. I'd miss easy overheads, double fault on crucial points, and feel the familiar, burning wave of embarrassment washing over my skin. There were moments during those 3 weeks when I would lock myself in the cramped, poorly lit locker room and simply sob. The pressure felt like a physical weight on my shoulders, a mountain I wasn't equipped to climb. I felt like a fraud, an imposter playing at being a champion when I was really just a terrified girl who wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. I questioned my decision every single hour. But during the second week, something shifted. I was in the middle of a particularly brutal drill, dripping with sweat and gasping for air, when I saw Maya standing by the fence. She wasn't shouting or cheering like the others. She was just watching me with wide, adoring eyes, holding a small, tattered tennis ball in her hand. She saw me struggling, she saw me fail, and she stayed. In that moment, I realized that my shyness wasn't just a cage, it was a filter. It allowed me to see the world with a clarity that loud people often missed. I didn't need to be loud to be effective. I just needed to be consistent. I turned back to the court, and for the first time in my life, I stopped listening to the noise of the crowd and started listening to the rhythm of my own breath. The day before the Atlantic Open was scheduled to begin, Mr. Henderson drove me to the stadium in downtown Cincinnati. It was a massive, intimidating structure of blue steel and bright, artificial lights. Standing at the baseline of the main court, looking up at the thousands of empty seats that would soon be filled with judgmental eyes, I felt a familiar, icy dread creeping up my spine. The stadium was silent, but it was a heavy, expectant silence that felt louder than a roar. I stood there for a long time, closing my eyes and trying to visualize the trajectory of my serves. I felt the cold sweat on my palms and the frantic fluttering of my heart. But then I reached into the pocket of my hoodie and felt the small, worn tennis ball that Maya had given me that morning. It had "Good luck, Chloe" written on it in messy, purple permanent marker. I held it tight, and the panic began to recede, replaced by a cold, quiet determination. I wasn't just Chloe the shy girl anymore. I was a representative of everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong in the spotlight. I was the shadow, and it was time to step onto the stage. The morning of the first round of the Atlantic Open was a surreal nightmare of sensory overload. I couldn't bring myself to eat anything. Even the thought of toast felt like trying to swallow dry sand. Mr. Henderson drove me to the player's entrance in his old, rattling sedan, and the transition from the quiet of the car to the chaos of the stadium was jarring. Security guards with earpieces, frantic officials with clipboards, and the distant, rhythmic thud of tennis balls hitting strings created an atmosphere of high-tension electricity. I was ushered into the main locker room, a sprawling, luxurious space filled with the top-ranked players on the regional circuit. They were a different breed, confident, loud, and seemingly comfortable in their own skin. Some were blasting heavy metal through their headphones, others were engaging in boisterous banter with their coaches, and a few were already doing explosive plyometric jumps in the middle of the floor. I found a small, isolated locker in the very back corner and sat down, staring intently at the laces of my sneakers. I felt like a small, defenseless prey animal that had somehow wandered into a den of apex predators. I kept my own noise-canceling headphones on, not even playing any music, just using them as a physical barrier to keep the world from reaching me. When my name was finally announced over the stadium's massive PA system, I felt a physical jolt in my stomach that made me lightheaded. The walk from the quiet sanctuary of the locker room through the concrete tunnel toward the court felt like a journey to the center of a volcano. As I stepped out into the arena, the sheer wall of sound hit me like a physical blow. Thousands of people were in the stands, their voices merging into a low, indistinct roar that vibrated in my chest. I kept my head down, the brim of my white hat pulled low over my eyes, and hurried toward my bench like a criminal trying to avoid a camera. I could hear the commentators in the glass-walled booth above me. And here we have the wild card entry, Chloe Reed. A bit of a mystery, this one. She hasn't played a competitive match in years. It'll be interesting to see if she has the mental fortitude to survive on a stage this large. Their words felt like a cold splash of water, a public confirmation of my own deepest insecurities. My opponent, Madison, was already at the net, looking vibrant and aggressive in her neon yellow kit. She was everything I feared: loud, confident, and clearly thriving in the spotlight. The warm-up was an absolute disaster for me. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely toss the ball straight for my practice serves. My timing was completely off, and I was framing half of my forehands, sending them flying into the back fence. I could see Madison smirking at her coach, her body language radiating a dismissive, predatory confidence. She had already decided that I was a mental midget, someone who would fold under the slightest pressure. When the chair umpire called time and I walked to the baseline to serve first, the stadium went quiet, but it was the kind of silence that feels heavy with judgment. I bounced the ball 1, 2, 3, 4 times, trying to find a rhythm. My first serve hit the very bottom of the net. My second serve was a weak, nervous puff that Madison immediately crushed for a return winner. Within 15 minutes, I was down 3-0, and I felt like I was drowning in a sea of my own embarrassment. Every time I looked up at the crowd, my vision would blur, and I'd feel that familiar, burning urge to just drop my racket and run out of the stadium. At the first changeover, I sat on my bench and pulled a white towel over my entire head, creating a tiny, dark room for myself. The darkness under the towel was the only place I felt safe. I could hear the crowd murmuring, probably wondering what was wrong with the weird girl in the white hat. But in that small, dark space, I remembered what Mr. Henderson had told me on court 4. The lines of the court don't change because people are watching, Chloe. 60 feet is 60 feet. The ball doesn't know who is in the stands. I took a long, deep, agonizingly slow breath, letting the carbon dioxide build up in my lungs until I was forced to exhale. I thought about the unpaid bills on Mr. Henderson's desk. I thought about Maya's purple marker ball. I realized that if I let my shyness win today, I was letting down everyone who had ever believed in me. I pulled the towel off my head, stood up, and walked to the baseline. I didn't look at the crowd. I didn't look at the cameras. I narrowed my field of vision until the only things that existed in the universe were the yellow ball and the white lines of the court. I served an ace, 115 miles per hour, right down the tee. The match had finally begun. By the time the first set reached its conclusion, the entire energy in the stadium had undergone a profound transformation. I had lost the set 6-4, but I had won the final 3 games with a level of clinical, silent intensity that seemed to catch Madison and the entire audience completely off guard. I wasn't playing with the flashy, emotional energy of a typical pro. I was playing with the cold, focused precision of someone who had spent thousands of hours hitting against a wall in the dark. I didn't scream when I hit a winner, I didn't pump my fist after a crucial break point, and I didn't look toward the player's box for validation. I was a ghost on the court, moving with a fluid, haunting efficiency that made Madison's aggressive style look frantic and disorganized. The crowd, which had initially been rooting for the queen of the court, was now watching in a kind of hushed, respectful awe. They were starting to realize that the girl who wouldn't look them in the eye was the most dangerous person in the arena. The second set was a masterclass in the power of observation. Because I had spent my entire life watching people from the sidelines, I was naturally attuned to Madison's subtle physical cues. I noticed the tiny hitch in her shoulder before she hit a kick serve. I saw the way her footwork slowed down when she was forced into a long rally. I began to dismantle her game with surgical accuracy, hitting behind her when she expected a cross-court shot and pulling her into the net only to lob her with a perfectly disguised topspin backhand. I won the second set 6-2 in less than 30 minutes. Madison was visibly unraveling. She started arguing with the umpire, throwing her racket into the blue turf, and shouting at her own coach. To her, my silence was an insult, a psychological tactic she couldn't figure out. She didn't realize it wasn't a tactic, it was just me. I was finally using my introversion as a weapon. I was letting the ball do all the talking I had never been able to do with my voice. As the match moved into the deciding third set, I felt a strange, new sensation that I can only describe as the flow. It's a state that many athletes talk about, but for someone with social anxiety, it feels like a spiritual transcendence. In the flow, the self, the part of me that is constantly worrying about judgment and embarrassment, simply ceases to exist. There was no Chloe Reed on that court. There was only the flight of the ball, the friction of the strings, and the tactical geometry of the court. I felt like I was part of a larger, silent machine. The roar of the crowd, which had once felt like an assault on my senses, now sounded like the distant hum of the ocean. It was background noise, completely irrelevant to the task at hand. I broke Madison's serve in the very first game of the set and never looked back. When I hit the final, cross-court volley to win the match, the stadium erupted into a standing ovation that was so loud it made the ground vibrate under my feet. The victory was exhilarating, but it was immediately followed by my greatest fear, the post-match on-court interview. A woman in a sharp blazer with a wireless microphone and a massive television crew sprinted toward me before I could even pack my rackets. I felt the familiar wave of panic trying to settle in my chest, the cold sweat returning to my palms. The interviewer smiled warmly, her eyes sparkling with the excitement of a Cinderella story. Chloe, that was an absolutely legendary performance. Where have you been hiding? The world wants to know who you are. I looked at the camera lens, that giant glass eye that was broadcasting my face to millions, and then I looked back at the ground. My throat felt like it was filled with dry wool. I just really love the game, I managed to whisper into the microphone, my voice cracking slightly. I'm just happy I could help save my club. Thank you for being here. It was a terrible interview by professional standards. I didn't give a charismatic soundbite, I didn't thank 15 sponsors, and I didn't smile for the cameras. But as I hurried off the court toward the sanctuary of the tunnel, I saw Mr. Henderson in the front row, his face streaked with tears of joy. I realized that I didn't need to be a media darling. I had done the job I came to do. The days following my first-round victory were a blur of intense physical activity and an even more intense psychological struggle. Suddenly, the ghost of the baseline was the primary headline in every sports publication in the region. People were fascinated by the girl who played like a goddess, but couldn't seem to look a reporter in the eye. My social media accounts, which had been dormant for years, were suddenly flooded with thousands of notifications. The attention was like a physical pressure, a constant, low-level humming that made it impossible for me to truly relax. Every time I left my hotel room to go to the practice courts, I had to run a gauntlet of fans and amateur photographers. I felt like a hunted animal, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering who was watching me and what they were saying about the weird, silent girl. The very thing I had spent my entire life trying to avoid, being the center of attention, was now my daily reality. It was exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with tennis. On the night before my quarterfinal match, the anxiety finally reached a breaking point. I was sitting on the floor of my hotel room, my back pressed against the cold mahogany of the bed frame, trying to regulate my breathing. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in on me as I spiraled into a full-blown panic attack. Every mistake I had ever made, every social embarrassment I had ever suffered, was playing on a loop in my mind. I felt like an imposter who was about to be exposed on a national stage. I picked up the phone with trembling hands and called Mr. Henderson at the club. "I can't do it anymore," I whispered into the receiver, the tears finally breaking through. "I want to go home." "The money isn't worth this, Mr. Henderson. I feel like everyone is waiting for me to fail." I can feel their eyes through the walls of the hotel. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a girl who's good at hitting a ball in the dark." Mr. Henderson didn't respond immediately. He just let me cry for a few minutes, providing a silent, supportive presence on the other end of the line. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and steady like an anchor in a storm. "Chloe, do you remember why we call it the baseline?" I sniffled and shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. "It's not just a tennis term," he continued. "A baseline is a starting point. It's the foundation you build everything else on. For 22 years, your baseline has been fear. You've built your entire life around the idea that being seen is dangerous. But look at what's happened in the last week. You've been seen by thousands of people and you're still standing. You haven't dissolved. You haven't disappeared. The world didn't end because you hit a backhand in front of a crowd. Those people in the stands? They're not your judges, Chloe. They're just people who are inspired by a girl who is brave enough to be exactly who she is, even when her hands are shaking." His words hit me with the force of a physical revelation. I had spent so long viewing the audience as a collective monster that I had forgotten that they were made of individuals who were likely just as flawed, scared, and insecure as I was. I wasn't being punished by their attention. I was being celebrated for my struggle. I spent the rest of the night practicing a new kind of meditation. Instead of trying to block out the world, I tried to invite it in. I visualized the stadium as a giant, warm room filled with friends. I pictured the cameras not as judgmental eyes, but as windows that allowed the kids back at the baseline to see that their coach was fighting for them. By the time the sun began to rise over the Cincinnati skyline, I didn't feel cured of my shyness. I don't think I ever will be, but I felt a sense of peace. I realized that my anxiety was like the wind on the court. You can't stop it from blowing, but you can learn how to adjust your shots to account for it. The quarterfinal match was against a woman named Elena, the defending champion and a physical powerhouse who hit the ball with a violence that made the air whistle. The stadium was packed to the rafters, and the noise was a deafening, vibrating roar. But as I walked out of the tunnel and onto the bright blue court, I didn't look at my shoes. I stopped at the net, took a deep breath of the humid air, and actually looked up. I looked at the faces in the front row. I saw a young boy wearing a ragged tennis hat, looking at me with pure, unadulterated hope. I saw a group of elderly women holding a sign that said, "The shadow strikes again." They weren't looking at me with judgment, they were looking at me with love. I felt a strange, new sensation, a connection to the world. It was a connection that didn't require me to speak a single word. I realized that my tennis was my language, and for the first time in my life, I was actually excited to share it with everyone. I turned to the baseline, tossed the ball high into the air, and hit the most powerful serve of my life. I was no longer hiding in the shadows. I was the one casting them. The semifinals were a grueling, 3-hour marathon that pushed my body to the absolute edge of its endurance, but my mind remained strangely, beautifully calm. When I finally hit the winning overhead and realized I was going to the finals, I didn't feel the surge of panic I had expected. Instead, I felt a profound sense of clarity. The final was scheduled for Sunday afternoon on national television against the world-ranked number 2 player, Victoria the Valkyrie Vance. Victoria was the absolute antithesis of me. She was 6 feet tall, radiant, charismatic, and she possessed a voice that could fill a stadium without the help of a microphone. She was the face of global tennis, a fashion icon, a media darling, and a ferocious competitor who thrived on the energy of a crowd. The media were already calling the match the Queen versus the Ghost, a classic battle of opposites. The pressure from the outside world was immense, but inside the small, quiet bubble of my hotel room, I felt ready. I spent the day before the final watching old tapes of Victoria's matches, not out of fear, but out of a calm, analytical curiosity. I saw the patterns in her game, the subtle cracks in her confidence when she was forced to play against someone who didn't react to her emotional outbursts. The morning of the final, I arrived at the stadium early. I wanted to feel the space while it was still empty, before the thousands of spectators turned it into a theater of noise. I stood at the very center of the court, the morning sun casting long shadows across the blue surface. I stood there for nearly an hour, just breathing, feeling the texture of the air and the grip of my shoes on the court. I wasn't trying to be brave, I was just trying to be present. When the time for the match finally arrived, the atmosphere in the stadium was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was a physical weight, a thick, vibrating energy that made my skin tingle. As I walked out of the tunnel, the roar of the crowd was so intense it felt like a shockwave. Victoria was already there, waving to the fans, her smile bright and effortless. She looked like she belonged on a throne. I walked to my bench, unpacked my rackets with slow, deliberate movements, and felt the small, tattered ball in my pocket. Maya and Mr. Henderson were in the player's box, their faces tight with a mixture of pride and anxiety. I gave them a small, barely perceptible nod. I was here. I was ready. The first set was a brutal reality check. Victoria was faster, stronger, and more experienced than anyone I had ever faced. Her serve felt like a cannonball, and her return of serve was so aggressive it barely gave me time to set my feet. She moved me from side to side with a relentless, punishing rhythm. Within 25 minutes, she had won the first set 6-1. The crowd was ecstatic, cheering for the Valkyrie as she dominated the quiet girl from Ohio. I sat on my bench during the set break, the sweat dripping off my chin, feeling the familiar, cold finger of shame poking at my heart. "See?" the voice in my head whispered. "You don't belong here. You're just a club player who got lucky. You're being exposed in front of the whole world." I looked over at the player's box. Maya was holding up her purple marker ball, her face filled with an unwavering belief in me. She didn't care about the score. She just wanted to see her coach fight. I took a sip of water, wiped my face, and looked across the net. Victoria was laughing with her coach, her body language radiating a supreme, almost bored confidence. She thought the match was already over. She thought I was just another opponent who would crumble under the weight of her personality. That thought, the sheer, arrogant dismissiveness of it, ignited a spark of defiance deep in my soul. I realized that my shyness had always made me an underdog, and as an underdog, I had nothing left to lose. I stood up, walked to the baseline, and changed my entire tactical approach. Instead of trying to match Victoria's power, I started to use her own momentum against her. I began hitting the ball earlier, taking time away from her. I started using junk balls, slices, moon balls, and short-angled volleys to break her rhythm. I stopped trying to play perfect tennis and started playing smart tennis. The crowd went quiet as they watched the momentum of the match slowly, almost imperceptibly, begin to shift. I won the second set 7-5, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine doubt in Victoria's eyes. The third set of the Atlantic Open final was not a game of tennis, it was a psychological war of attrition. Both of us were physically exhausted, our muscles screaming and our breath coming in ragged gasps. Every point was a 20-shot rally, a brutal test of who would blink first. Victoria was no longer laughing. She was grunting with every hit, her face contorted with the effort of trying to overpower the girl who wouldn't go away. I remained a silent, focused machine. I didn't celebrate my winners, and I didn't mourn my errors. I just kept moving, kept hitting, and kept observing. We traded breaks of serve, neither of us able to pull away. The score reached 6-6. A tie-break to decide the championship. The stadium was so quiet you could hear the distant sound of a car horn from the street outside. I stepped to the line to serve the first point. I looked at the ball. The yellow felt fuzzy against the bright blue of the court. I tossed it, swung, and hit an ace wide on the line. 1-0. The tiebreak was a microcosm of my entire life. I would get ahead, then the fear would creep in and I'd make a mistake. Victoria would roar, the crowd would go wild, and I'd feel like I was shrinking. But every time I felt the panic rising, I would look at the lines of the court. They were straight. They were honest. They didn't care about my anxiety. I fought my way to 6-6 in the tiebreak. At that moment, we played a point that people would talk about for years. Victoria hit a massive forehand that sent me sprinting into the corner. I managed to slice it back. She crushed a volley at my feet. I somehow dug it out and hit a lob. She tracked it down and hit an overhead. I dove for the ball, scraping my knee on the turf, and flicked a passing shot that caught the very edge of the line. 7-6, match point. My serve. I walked to the baseline, my legs feeling like they were made of lead, my heart pounding in my ears like a drum. This was the moment I had feared my entire life. All eyes were on me. The cameras were zoomed in on my face. The world was waiting for me to act. I bounced the ball once, twice, 3 times. I looked at the tee. I didn't think about the crowd or the money or the fame. I thought about Mr. Henderson's cracked courts. I thought about the smell of old sneakers and the sound of the wind through the hedges. I tossed the ball, reached up as high as I could, and snapped my wrist. The ball blurred through the air and hit the corner of the service box with a loud thwack. Victoria didn't even move. Ace. The match was over. I had won. The next few minutes were a blur of sound and light. I didn't fall to the ground or scream at the sky. I just stood there, my chest heaving, the racket hanging from my hand. Victoria came over the net and gave me a long, genuine hug. "You're incredible," she said, her voice filled with a surprising amount of respect. "You're the toughest person I've ever played." I managed a small, tired smile and whispered, "Thank you." I walked to the player's box and hugged Mr. Henderson. He didn't say a word, he just held me while he cried. I looked at Maya, who was jumping up and down, waving her purple marker ball like a flag of victory. I realized then that I hadn't just won a tournament. I had won the right to be exactly who I am. I was Chloe Reed, the girl who was too shy to order a coffee, but brave enough to be the champion of the Atlantic Open. The weeks that followed my victory were a whirlwind of opportunities that would have once felt like a death sentence. I had a team of people now who handled the media, the sponsors, and the logistics. I made it very clear from the beginning. I would not do talk shows, I would not do day-in-the-life reality segments, and I would not be a spokesperson for anything that didn't feel authentic. To my surprise, the world didn't mind. In fact, they seemed to embrace my quietness. I became a different kind of role model, the one for the kids who sat in the back of the room, for the people who were told that you have to be loud to be successful. I signed a few carefully chosen endorsement deals that allowed me to do something I had dreamed of since I was a child. I bought the baseline from the bank, paid off all its debts, and turned it into a non-profit foundation. We renovated the courts, built a new clubhouse with a quiet study area for the kids, and established a scholarship for young athletes who struggled with anxiety and learning disabilities. I still live in my small apartment, and I still drive the same car. My life hasn't changed as much as people might think. I still get nervous when I have to make a phone call. I still avoid large parties, and I still prefer the company of a good book to a crowded bar. But the internal landscape of my mind has shifted fundamentally. I no longer view my shyness as a prison, I view it as a perspective. It's the lens through which I see the world, and while it might be different from the lens everyone else uses, it's just as valid. I've learned that you don't have to overcome who you are to achieve great things. You just have to find the thing you love enough that you're willing to let the world see you do it. For me, that thing is tennis. It's the language I use to express my strength, my focus, and my soul. I'm currently training for the upcoming professional season. I'll be playing at Wimbledon, the French Open, and the US Open. The thought of those giant stadiums and the global audience still makes my stomach flip with anxiety. I know there will be days when I want to hide under a towel in the locker room. I know there will be matches where the pressure feels like it's crushing me. But I also know that when I step onto the court, I am not alone. I carry the support of Mr. Henderson, the hopes of the kids at the club, and the spirit of every quiet person who has ever been told they weren't enough. I am no longer a ghost haunting the sidelines of my own life. I am the lead actress in a story I am finally proud to tell. I'm sitting on the bench at Court 4 today, watching Maya practice her serve. The club is buzzing with activity, the sound of laughter, the thud of balls, and the smell of fresh-cut grass. Maya hits a beautiful ace down the tee and gives a small, quiet pump of her fist. She looks over at me and smiles, a confident, knowing smile. She doesn't need to say a word, and neither do I. We understand each other perfectly. I've realized that the greatest victory wasn't the trophy in the glass case in the lobby. It was the realization that my silence isn't a lack of something, it's a presence. It's the quiet before the storm, the focus before the hit, the peace in the center of the chaos. My name is Chloe, and I am a champion. And I think I've said quite enough.